Yeah, so thank you so much for having me come out to talk to you today. I do work at the Bedford VA, and honestly, doing these kinds of things is actually one of my absolute favorite. I mean, it's obviously it can be a very sad or a very moving kind of an event, but I find it very meaningful and very impactful. What I'm talking to you about today is called a S.A.V.E training. It's what's called a gatekeeper training. Jim put together this very lovely flyer, or your son put together this very lovely flyer, and I think on the flyer it says a gatekeeper training, and that's exactly what it is, because what we know is that the work that we do at the VA is very important. However, there are so many veterans that do not get care at the VA, either because they choose not to or because they're not eligible. Or they're interacting in all sorts of other ways in the community. So there are lots of gatekeepers. Friends, family members that are interacting, firefighters, interacting with veterans every day. And we all play our role, a very important role in veterans' lives. That's why we do trainings like this, and I was so excited to be invited, out to talk to all of you. Actually, could you remind me on the timing? I want to be very conscious. Jim, remind me of the timing. No, could you tell me how much time I have? 9 o'clock. Okay, all right. Well, hopefully I don't talk at you too long. Okay, so this is an overview of today. So I'm going to share video. Hopefully the sound works, and thank you, Lisa, for being such a whiz.
I found myself in a pretty dark place for a pretty long period of time, and just feeling sort of trapped in a way, just not knowing exactly what I should do next. I was sort of at my wit's end as to what was my purpose in life.
I mean, coming back, the switch was off. It had an impact on all my relationships, all my family relationships. I couldn't even. I was wondering if I ever had grandchildren, could I love them because of, the disconnect.
I'd also submitted my work that I did in Iraq for Military Videographer of the Year, and I'm standing there, and all these people, the pinnacle, like, I am the best. I just became the best. I felt absolutely nothing and completely dissatisfied with the whole experience.
I had a few hobbies. It was mainly like auto repair and racing, maybe dirt bike, stuff like that. And that stuff, I tried it when I got back, and it just didn't give me any excitement.
After a 21-year career in nursing, I got into the point where it was hard for me to get out of bed every morning. I was lethargic. I had anhedonia, which mean I had no pleasure from anything that I did. And I had suicidal ideation, and I had a little bit of a plan to turn around and walk in the front of a car.
I went from being super active, doing everything around the house. Now for 12 months, I was more of a burden on my family, and I just kept feeling more and more worthless. And that's when I contemplated starting to take my life.
This friend of mine who was a veteran introduced me to the group. There was a different connection, a different understanding about what was happening. And that is what began to make the difference for me.
I talked to the psychiatrist down there, and then she recommended me to they have like an outpatient psychiatry department down there. So they recommended the medication, and then I did like one-on-one counseling sessions, and I've been doing it ever since.
One day, one of my kids said something to me that, made me realize I need to get help. I need to be there to help them. The VA crisis line was the first place I called, and then I started trying to meet with a counselor.
It showed me that regardless of my medical problems, a lot of the limitations that I felt were limitations I just placed on myself. That I could still enjoy a lot of the same activities that I did, just in a different way, and get the same result.
I would say for the last 5 or 6 years, not only have I not had depression, but I've also been happy.
After I started seeking the help, the work performance started to increase again. I started believing in myself, I started getting more confidence. It was a lot easier to do my job, do daily things.
You got to reach out. You got to put your hand out. You got to make the first step, and that's the hard one, is the first step.
Know that there is a way that you can get help. There is a way that you can deal with some of the difficulties related to your war experience. Look at it as a community of people who want to help. I think that has felt different for me, and to keep at it until you make the connection.
So the point actually I was trying to make about the video, not so much the treatment part, and we will get into that, but the point about the video is that what people bring to the table, how the causes, how it shows up, can look really different for different folks. And that's actually the point about the video, is that it can just show up in many different ways. It happens to so many different people from so many different walks of life. And that is really just the point about the video. It's hard to capture that in just a short amount of time, but that's the point I was trying to make in that. I will add that this is a heavy topic that we're talking about today. So, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Come talk to me afterwards if you need to. Talk here if you need to, because this is a heavy topic. I'm not going to spend actually too much time talking about the actual facts of suicide, but I do want to try to clarify some things, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about suicide. And unfortunately, that can lead, that can really affect whether or not somebody might ask for help or offer help. So that's why we do spend some time trying to share information. So, suicide is a national issue. It does not just affect veterans, although unfortunately veterans are disproportionately affected by this. Suicide is a national public health issue. It's the 10th leading cause of death for the general population. For every one death by suicide, it affects 135 other individuals. So what we mean by that is, when there's one death, that affects the person, the spouse, the children, the priest, the people that went to school with that person, the people who lived down the block, the neighbors, the people who walk the dog, everybody within 135 person radius is affected by that death. And I think, your explanation in the beginning is a perfect example of that. Those deaths, those were important people, and their lives and their passing radiated out. Had an impact, unfortunately, on so many other people. What we know about suicide is that there's not just one single cause to it. There are so many different things that go into whether or not somebody decides to die by suicide. There's things at the individual level. There's things, so for example, whether or not somebody has a history of mental health issues or current mental health issues. There's things at the community level. There are things, so for example, access to jobs, access to food, access to housing. There's things at the societal level. For example, the pandemic. That was a huge, that had a huge effect on all of us. So there are things, again, that affect all of us at all of these different levels, and whether or not we are thinking about suicide. And there are certain risk and protective factors that we all have, regardless of whether or not we're thinking about suicide. But there are things that put us at more or less risk. And so when we're talking about suicide prevention, the things that we want to be thinking about are those risk and protective factors. We want to be decreasing the risk factors and increasing the protective factors. So there are some risk factors that we cannot change. And there are some protective factors that we cannot change. But there are some that we can. So for example, under the risk factors, and this is not a comprehensive list, there's many things that are not listed here, but these are some big heavy hitters. So risk factors, we have a prior suicide attempt or suicide attempts, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, access to lethal means. So when I say access to lethal means, this is something like a firearm. Access to also opioids would be another one. A recent loss. This could be a loss of a marriage, a loss of an important family member. Also a loss like a house. So loss could be a lot of things like that. Legal or financial issues we know are huge risk factors. Employment, homelessness, again, all very important risk factors. So what I was starting to say at the beginning of this was some of these risk factors are things that we can't change. So I can't change whether or not somebody has a history of a suicide attempt. I can't change if somebody has lost a parent recently. But I can change whether or not someone has access to health care. I can change whether or not someone is getting treatment for their medical issues. I can change if someone has help for their housing struggles. So when we're talking about increasing the protective factors, that's what I mean when I'm talking about that. On the flip side, so the protective factors, I mean, essentially these are the reverse, but again, access to mental health care, feeling like they have some kind of connection. So I'll tell you that it sounds like a lot of the people in this room have a connection, which is that it sounds like you guys are or many of you are on the Melrose Veterans Advisory Board. Will you raise your hand if you are, just out of curiosity? Okay. So it sounds like maybe 70%, give or take, of you. So that's, right off the bat, 70% of you I know have a great protective factor right there. What a wonderful thing. So pleased to see that. Yeah.
I'm surprised that under risk, horrible nightmares.
Yeah, and as I was saying, this is not a comprehensive list. This is a synthesized list. But yes, absolutely. And it's going to be different for different people. So for example, some folks might not consider having a lot of strong social relationships that big of a deal. Might not be that important a factor to them, but for other folks it would be. For some folks, having a lot of sleep disruption, having nightmares, is going to be a very significant risk factor. I'll tell you about a really prominent or a well-known case that I think we could all talk about, which is Robin Williams. I think he was known to have taken his life, and he, I believe, was given an MS diagnosis. I think that was, if I'm not mistaken. So again, the health, the physical health, that was a big risk factor. So, yeah, it just goes to show you, you know, there are different risk factors for all of us. And I think, you know, for some folks, you know, you might take a physical health issue in stride, and, you know, you run with it, and it's a part of your life, and it's, you know, that's okay. That's who I am. And others, it hits you hard, and it compounds on top of trauma and other things, and, you know, your cup is filled up to the top, and it feels like too much. So it kind of depends. I've heard, actually maybe somebody said it here, but you have to look for like big changes for people you know. So I think we were just starting, or I was starting to say earlier, that a big risk factor is access to lethal means. And this is one that we talk about a lot when I do trainings, or when we do trainings. So especially for our veteran population, they are much more likely than our non-veterans to use firearms as a means of suicide. And as I'm sure you know, in fact, I think it was Jim who was saying that, you know, obviously firearms are, you know, almost instantaneous. You know, you can't, there's hardly ever coming back from a, you can't unfire a gun, essentially. So what this means in terms of like some of the work that we do, and others do in the community, is we have conversations called lethal means safety. So having conversations about how you know, safe storage. So in fact, I brought some gun locks. They're over there. They're cable locks. I have a slide on it. But essentially, lethal means safety is how to put time and space between that person and the means that they're thinking about. It's not about removing the firearm, although of course if that's the step they want to do, or whatever the means is that they're thinking about, it's about how to just put time and space between them and that thing. So even with the cable lock, for example, you know, it's going to take, you know, at least several minutes, like especially if the way that the cable lock works is, you know, it wraps around, there's a actual key that goes in. If the key is stored separately, it's at least going to take, I'd say, 5 minutes, or probably at the very least, to be able to do that. So it's going to take some time. So again, time and space between them and that object. So that's what we say when we're talking about lethal means safety, and the kind of conversations we want our clinicians to be having with the veterans. Because what we know is that most crises are often very brief. The peak can be very brief in terms of time. So very often people are thinking about suicide for less than an hour. So 71% of folks before they attempt suicide are thinking about it for less than an hour. About 50% are thinking about it for less than 20 minutes, and 24% are thinking about it for less than 5 minutes before they take action. So again, that's how important it is that somebody who's in crisis doesn't have that immediate access to that thing that they're thinking about. And like I said, as we know, the effects of a gunshot wound can be instantaneous. And in fact, if you were to total all the means of suicide, besides firearm shootings, they would not add up to all the other methods. I'm sorry, of suicides. They would not add up to the amount of fatalities of firearms. So firearms are fatal in 85 to about 90% of cases. So any questions or thoughts about that?
Actually, I do have a question.
Yeah,
With that being said,
yeah,
when a lot of the veterans, the majority of first responders, veterans and so forth, they have a firearm.
yeah,
So when they go to seek that help, that's probably whether it's job related, or just in general, whether they're a hunter, whatever it is, that is probably a main factor in their thought process of not seeking help.
I know.
Due to the fact if
I
they
know.
do, by default, they're losing. Seeking that help
absolutely.
is a tremendous loss potentially on the other side. So
Yep,
it's kind of that double-edged sword where, where do you come or how do you go?
absolutely.
To reach out to those folks that probably need that help,
Yes.
but either do through employment,
Mm-hmm.
could be a way of life. You know, a lot of folks aren't in the inner city, they hunt,
Mm-hmm.
do other
Yeah.
reasons to have a firearm, not just in life and property, whatever else it is, but there's a lot of factors involved that
Yeah.
that is a lot of the reason that I've talked to a lot of folks that they would never go in and
I
see
know.
because they would lose their either ability to maintain employment and or, which is getting a little better on the employment side.
Yeah.
But on the hunting side, just
Mhm.
the ability to have
Mhm.
a firearm. A lot of these guys are 20-year vets or whatever it is.
I know.
And they've had a firearm their entire life. They grew up in the country. I'm from Boston, so
Yeah.
I didn't grow up with one, but there's a lot of percentage of the country that their entire life, their parents, grandparents, and so forth, have firearms. So I don't know if that's something that's ever looked at.
Oh yeah, this is something that comes up so much because we work a lot with first responder groups, and it's so hard, especially for police in particular. And there's a really good group out of, oh my God, my brain is totally blanking. What is that college? Oh my gosh, in Natick. God, I can't, my brain is totally fried after today. Can't remember. Anyways, there's a Framingham lieutenant. I cannot remember the college for some reason, but they do this really wonderful training. Stonehill, there it is. Okay. They do this really wonderful training, and there's this lieutenant there. He's so great, and he talks all about it. And it's just so hard because that is absolutely the fear. So I think a lot of what the advice is to talk to a lot of the folks where you can frankly kind of get around it, like talk to chaplains, talk to like some of the peer groups. There's a lot more first responder groups now where you can hopefully get and seek the support, where it's less about getting sort of the reprimand and more about getting the support that you need. And I think some departments are better than others, frankly, but we've worked with some really good departments over the years, and I think there's a shift for some places. I'm not going to say it's like totally there yet, but I think there's starting to be a shift. Like McLean also has a really good program, the Leader program. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. That's also for first responders. So there's a shift. It's not quite there, but it's going in that direction. And I think like it's getting there. But I hear you. That fear definitely is there. Yeah.
I think if somebody wants to do it, they think about it, all you need is a handsaw or a razor blade.
Well, so that's sort of the point is that I'm trying to make, or that like we make in suicide prevention, is that actually, let me go to my next slide. This is a good lead into my next slide. Is that if we can reduce access to whatever it is that that person is thinking about, that our research shows that they actually don't go on to try to attempt again. And it's not that people, yes, people do have access, but in most cases, they don't go on to try. So there's this really interesting research study. Imagine most of you know the Golden Gate Bridge. So the Golden Gate Bridge used to be a place where a lot of folks had attempted or did die by suicide. And there was a lot of resistance for many years to build barriers on the bridge to keep people, from being able to jump off the side, because they said that it would sort of take away from like the beauty of the bridge. So they didn't do it. But fortunately, there were people who would go there and would, physically like deter people from jumping. So they did this research study, actually, that tracked these people who would go to the bridge and were stopped by these people who would deter them from jumping. And they tracked down these people, they followed them for many, many years. And what they found is that if they were physically stopped from jumping from the bridge, they didn't go on, 90% of them did not go on then to die by some other means, did not go on to die by suicide by some other means. And that was apparently enough of, good evidence that was successful. They actually did build barriers then at the Golden Gate Bridge to stop people from jumping. But in any case, there's a lot of good research to show that if people have less access to means, that they don't go find other means. So hopefully I'm making my case that in crisis, if we can limit access, that is a good thing. Not all the time. I'm not saying we should, keep people in, cloth rooms. I'm just saying in a crisis, we should limit access. Okay. Okay, so I was starting to say, there's a lot of myths out there about suicide. And unfortunately, these myths can keep people from accessing help and from other people from asking for help. So a very common myth is that there are people who talk, the people who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. So they don't want help, or they don't want, they're not gonna actually act on it. They just want attention. And the reality is that even if someone has said something and you think it's a joke, they might actually have real, suicidal thoughts behind that. And that that is actually a really good window of opportunity to ask them, hey, what do you mean by that? Because as I'm sure, we've all experienced in our life, sometimes it's easier to say something and sort of pass it off as a joke. So think of it more as a window of opportunity to ask that person what they really mean. Next one. So The only one who can really help someone who is suicidal is a mental health counselor or therapist. I'm glad to see a lot of shaking heads. You don't have to be a trained mental health professional to do this. And that's why we do these trainings. That's why we have gatekeeper trainings, because you all do the work. You do it every day, I'm sure. I don't even have to ask you. I know you do. That's why you're here. I love this example. So I used to volunteer. This was before I even did this work. I used to volunteer for Samaritans. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Samaritans. They're the suicide hotline in Boston. And so they, I don't know if you're familiar with their origin story, but they, the way that they got started was that it started as like a church group. It doesn't have a religious affiliation now, but it started as a church group. So what happened was they noticed that congregants would come, and I think very often they were women who were helping the priest, serve tea and cookies while, they were waiting to be seen by the priest, serve them and talk to the people who were waiting in the waiting room and listen to what was going on. And the people felt really heard and listened to. So even before they even met the priest, they were just feeling heard and listened to. And that was enough. And that's how Samaritans started. So they were just talking to their peers. So I love that story because the congregants were just getting support by their peers. So anyways, I think that's the point, is like you can just, listen to your buddy that you served with and about their struggles that they're going through. That's all you have to do. So S.A.V.E is an acronym. It's meant to help kind of keep in mind how you know when someone might be in crisis and then sort of what to do. Yeah. So, so these are the these are the parts of S.A.V.E. S is the signs of suicidal thinking. A is asking the question. V, validating the veteran. E is encouraging treatment and expedite getting help. So S, the signs. So actually this gets back at, I think, a lot of the risk factors that we talked about earlier. So there's a lot of overlap here. But hopelessness, certainly feeling like there's no way out, anxiety, agitation. I feel like sleeplessness, I think we were saying that earlier. I can certainly say for myself, if I have not been sleeping, I know I'm not in a good frame of mind. I'm not making good choices. And I will tell you that so often if veterans tell me that they had a recent suicide attempt, they will tell me they have not been sleeping well in the days before. You're just not in a great frame of mind with that. Certainly feeling like there's no reason to live. Rage and anger, I think, is one I often like to emphasize, because I think traditionally speaking, when you think about suicide, you might think, oh, that person's depressed or they're sad or, something like that. But that's not always what this might look like. It might look like more of like an outburst or anger, or, of course, drugs, alcohol, that's a big risk factor. The other thing I'll emphasize here is engaging in risky activities. Maybe this sort of gets at your point. One I think I hear also a lot about is like driving recklessly, driving all over the place, you know, doing things that maybe they're not, you know, obviously dangerous, but not, you know, is pretty risky. Yeah. Certainly isolating, withdrawing from friends or family. So any of the following, these are things that sort of need immediate attention. So if somebody's sort of telling you that they're actively thinking about hurting or killing themselves, you know, they're really looking for a way to die, like they're looking for, let's say, a bridge or something like that, talking about death, dying, or suicide, or that very, you know, very risky behavior, especially, you know, if they're talking about firearms or drugs, alcohol, things like that. Asking the question. So this might seem simple, like, you know, I can ask a question. Why do we have to have a whole, you know, discussion about this? But I will tell you, it's not as simple as it seems. So you could say, are you thinking about killing yourself? So some important do's and don'ts. So do ask the question if you identified those warning signs and symptoms that we talked about. But try to ask the question in a way that flows with the conversation. So, for example, when I introduce myself to veterans, I don't say, I'm Becky from Suicide Prevention. Are you going to kill yourself today? Because veterans feel like I'm trying to check a box. And I will tell you, the last thing veterans want is to feel like a box is being checked. That is the last thing that they want. So I try not to do that. I try to wait till it makes sense in the conversation. And on the reverse, some important don'ts. So I don't say, you're not going to kill yourself, right? So why wouldn't you want to say it like that? You're what? You don't want to make them feel judged. Judged, yep. Mm-hmm. Or shamed, yes. You're asking for a no, yeah. You're leading, yes. And you may be inadvertently telling them that you feel really uncomfortable. Like, I don't know how to answer that. I don't want to answer that. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to help you. Like, please just, like, don't say that. So it is important to say, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking of suicide? And similarly, you know, try to incorporate it in the conversation, you know, as soon as is possible. Yeah. So it's a really good question, and it gets at that sort of comfortability piece. The reason why I'd encourage you to stick with either killing or suicide, and I know it's uncomfortable, is because some people do hurt themselves, meaning like cut themselves without any kind of suicidal intent. And so it has a different meaning or a different purpose. And that's why it's important, I think, to be clear and direct. Because the intention is very different, I think. Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of just cut to the chase. And, you know, people, you know, what's really funny is I think all of us feel really uncomfortable about asking about it. You know, I do a lot of trainings like this, and people feel really uncomfortable about asking about it. But I will tell you, I've never talked to somebody, for the most part, who says, I was so uncomfortable about being asked that question. It just doesn't happen. People don't really feel that uncomfortable about being asked that. If they don't have thoughts about suicide, they just say no. No, I wasn't thinking that. And actually, my next point about V, which is validating, being able to talk openly, being able to listen, and get back at the other point about you not having to be an expert. Just listen. Allow them to express their feelings. You can. It doesn't mean you don't need to understand that the situation is serious and not try to get them help, but you can also just listen. And while you're trying to get them help. If someone is suicidal, try not to leave him or her alone. Try to get them to seek help wherever that might be, 911 or otherwise. You can always call the crisis line, which I'll go over in a sec. So if you're talking with a veteran who's in crisis, or anyone who's in crisis, doesn't have to be a veteran, just try to remain calm. I'm sure many of you have talked to people in crisis. So I'm sure you've done this before. Use supportive, encouraging comments, that we'll get through this. Even if you don't have the answers, that, we'll figure this out, we'll get through this. You'll help them get to where they need to be. You can be honest that there's not sort of a quick solution here, because there isn't. There's no magic pill. There's no pixie dust. But we're gonna get through this. We're gonna get through the next 15 minutes. The next 15 minutes are the hardest. These are the hardest 15 minutes. But what happens after the next 15 minutes. It gets easier. It just does. So that is S.A.V.E. And actually, I brought some wallet cards that have this acronym on it. So if you're not sure, if you want to remember what it is, that you don't have to commit it to memory. And then everything else I have is just kind of resources. As I was saying before, this is about the crisis line. So I imagine most of you know the crisis line. If in case you don't, the crisis line is 988. You can still use the 1-800 number. That's still up and running, but 988 is just a lot easier to remember. You press 1 for it to go to the Veterans Crisis Line. Otherwise, it goes to the National Suicide Hotline, which is still, totally fine too. You can do online chat. You can do texting. Those are also fine options. I have a little video. Let's see. This one's a short one.
Honestly, I'm not really sure why I'm calling. It's just...
I'm having nightmares.
My husband and I, we're just fighting a lot.
I can't get any sleep.
Things just keep getting worse, and it's starting to feel like I can't do this by myself anymore.
We could use some help figuring things out.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you called. Why don't you tell me more about what's going on?
There's no wrong reason to reach out for crisis support. Whatever you're going through, the Veterans Crisis Line is here to help. Visit veteranscrisisline.net to learn more.
Yeah. The crisis line is great because it is owned and operated by the VA, but you don't have to be a veteran to call. You can be a friend, family member, police officer, you know, unregistered veteran, ineligible veteran. We have veterans who call from like Guam. You know, I think it's great. So.
I have a question about that line.
Yeah.
Can you, it's set up for the individual who's thinking about suicide to call.
Not necessarily.
Can you call on behalf of somebody who is thinking about suicide?
Correct. Yes. Anybody can call. In fact, we have lots of people who are not the veterans themselves who call.
Walk me through what happens when that call comes in.
So for example, we have lots of police officers or first responders that will call and use the crisis line sort of on behalf of the veteran. You know, Joe Smith is here in Melrose and he's like really struggling, and so maybe he you know, obviously I'm sure the responder will get them help in the moment for whatever is going on, but want them to like be connected to the VA or something, and we'll call sort of on behalf of the veteran in the moment. So like that has happened a bunch of times, which is great. I think that's a great use of it. So they'll do that, or you know, spouses, parents. Yeah, that happens all the time.
I'm kind of curious how it loops back to the individual, though, who's in crisis.
So if this is what will happen if so let's say a parent, you know, a father is calling about their son who's a veteran, and you know they're very concerned because the veteran is suicidal. The responder will try to get the parent to put the veteran on the phone if they're together or something, or will try to get the responder to call the veteran if they're not together. That's what will happen. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what will happen. And depending on like what I think is said, like, you know, I mean, I don't work at the crisis line, but I've seen these often enough that I'm pretty sure this is how it works. If the veteran themselves is able to talk to the responder and get the support, then that's great. Sometimes they're not able to talk with them, in which case the parent will talk to the responder, and then maybe the next day the parent will call me up and leave me a voicemail and say, my son, Joe Smith, really needs some support, and then I'll try to reach Joe Smith. So that actually gets at my next point, which is that there are 3 call centers, none of which are in Massachusetts. If the veteran wants the call, a consult can be sent to the local VA. So we get consults that we have to follow up with the next business day. If it's an emergency consult, so for example, like if a veteran had to go to the hospital, which I mean happens in some cases, but I think it's in less than like 2% of the calls. You know, we can follow up in those cases too. So the Compact Act. So the Compact Act is if you are in a suicidal crisis, you can present to an emergency room, any emergency room, and receive care for that. Either you or the emergency room just need to notify the emergency care number, essentially, within 72 hours.
But that could help that crisis moment.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you never want to not get care for that purpose. Yeah. And essentially, yeah. And the other thing that's really good about Compact Act is that that I particularly like is that it enables you now to be able to get to cover ambulance services, which was not a possibility before. So that's another really important change. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but we can also chat at later on too. So anyway, so that's a crisis line. I'm a suicide prevention coordinator. There's at least one of us. There's at our facility. There's there's 3 of us technically now, but most VAs have at least one suicide prevention coordinator. So if you're ever curious, you can look us up online. This was the mental health clinic I think we were just chatting about. That's the telephone number. This is just a bunch of resources. This is my team. I'm at the top, Becky Dreyfus. This is our email at the bottom if you need to reach us. Yeah. So
we used to in the city have a social worker, but with budget cuts, we lost that.
Well, I should have started off with this, but I used to do like emergency crisis work at Melrose Wakefield and Lawrence Memorial. So I used to come here and evaluate folks in your emergency room all the time. So Melrose has been, yeah. So Melrose has been near and dear to my heart for a long time. So I appreciate your city. Is it a city or a town?
A city.
A city. I have appreciated your city for a long time. So thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.